Today's session, I'm Adam Chambers from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm here and today's session is financing greenhouse gas reductions, and I would put in parentheses there, and carbon sequestration. This from agriculture and land use, the agriculture and land use sector. And so as I mentioned, I work for Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. My boss, Chief Weller, was here earlier today, and he touched on some of these finance items that we'd like to discuss with you all today and go through that. The forum that we're going to have is we're going to start with a round of introductions, allowing you to learn a little bit about our panel, the distinguished guests, and a little bit about who they work for. And then we're going to go back through, and I have a question for them. I'd like to understand what it is they have on their desk at this moment, kind of what they're working on, and what the big item that they're engaged in right now that's somehow relevant to this financing of reductions in greenhouse gases and carbon sequestration. And then I've got a few questions, but again, I'd like to rely on you all to come with questions. So we've got a microphone there, and we'll just take some questions and discuss these different finance mechanisms that may be able to achieve significant greenhouse gas reductions and carbon sequestration in this ag and forestry sector. So with that, I think we'll start with, I'd like to start at this end with Michelle, if you don't mind. Would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about your organization?
Sure. I'm Michelle Pastor. I'm Senior Climate Policy Advisor for the Nature Conservancy in our California office. I think many of you may be familiar with our organization, but we are a global nonprofit organization. We have offices in all 50 states and 35 countries, and our mission is to protect the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And so we see climate change as a major threat to our mission, and so my organization has invested in the effort to find climate solutions, and we have a particular interest in also finding natural climate solutions. How do we engage our natural working lands in climate solutions? And in California, I work primarily on the implementation of California's global warming law and its nexus with natural working lands, and my colleagues who are in the audience also work on that as well, Louis and Alex, and we also focus on climate resilience and how do we ensure that our natural resources are also resilient to the inevitable impacts of climate change.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So next we have Claire. Claire, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Claire Johns. I'm Assistant Secretary for Climate Issues at the California Natural Resources Agency. And the Natural Resources Agency is, of course, an agency within state government here. There are 39 departments, boards, and conservancies within the Resources Agency. It's a large umbrella organization, including state parks, the CAL FIRE, the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources, among others, and then a number of conservancies and boards like the Board of Forestry that work across the state on a range of natural resource issues. And on the climate side, we're working, I don't want to jump ahead too much to what's on my desk because I can barely see it right now, but we're really working on growing and developing the natural and working land strategy within the state's climate policy and also continuing to develop the adaptation strategy. So the Resources Agency is responsible for updating the Safeguarding California Plan, which is California's state adaptation strategy. And then we'll also be working on a number of other guidance documents and activities this year.
Great, thank you, Claire. And so we'll come to Mark Easter. Mark, where do you work, and tell us a little bit about your organization.
Sure. So I'm an ecologist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab. I'm a senior research associate in Keith Palestrin's research group. The Natural Resource Ecology Lab is a soft money, completely grant-funded research institute that's part of the Warner College of Natural Resources at CSU. We've got the acronym NREL, and we share that with another auspicious agency, the National Renewable Energy Lab, but we were first. We beat them by about 8 years. I work on greenhouse gas accounting in ecosystems, and a focus specifically on understanding what the greenhouse gas balance of different land management practices are, focusing on cropland, grazing land, agroforestry, and also forestry systems, with an eye towards developing inventory methods, learning how to inventory greenhouse gas emissions, look at the full suite of emissions across all the different source and subsource categories, put them all on a common balance sheet, try to understand what the net benefit or net emission is associated with changes in agricultural practices or forestry practices. I also work on decision support systems associated with that to try and inform land use agencies, farmers and ranchers, foresters, help them make decisions, good decisions going forward around conservation practices that may help with certain sorts of conservation aspects, but also specifically with an eye towards greenhouse gas, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration.
Great, Mark. Thank you. And last but definitely not least, Max, I like your tie.
Thanks. I like your tie. My name is Max Dubison. I'm a senior policy manager at the Climate Action Reserve. I think you might have seen our logo around. We are a nonprofit based in Los Angeles, although I am based out of Connecticut. We've been around since 2001, originally focusing on doing greenhouse gas inventories for companies here in California to help them get ready for greenhouse gas accounting for the government. And in 2005, I believe, started working on the forest offset protocol. So jumped into offsets with the easy one first, and then it wasn't easy. We spent a few years, but we got a wonderful forest protocol. We've got our forest director, John Nickerson, here. And then started moving into other types. Livestock digesters was another one. We've since developed around 16 or so different offset protocols and have had a heavier focus on agriculture and land use in the last, say, 5 years or so with nitrogen management and rice cultivation, and more recently avoided grassland conversion, which is one that we're really excited about and has sort of taken a lot of lessons learned within our organization and other organizations about offset protocols, and trying to make more of a focus on implementation and ease of use and bringing down the costs so that we can help the market.
Great, thanks, Max. So what I'd like to do now is we'll reverse it, and we're going to check with everybody on what's on your desk. And so this topic to me is very relevant. Conservation finance is something I'm working on extensively right now. We've got a few conservation innovation grants that we solicited last year that have come together to meet on conservation finance. How do we drive more kind of finance into conservation? I think at NRCS we see the conservation mission being much larger than our individual budget, and there's definitely an appetite for investment in conservation projects right now. I think there's a little bit of the mechanics that need to be worked out, and we've got kind of the block and tackle crew right here. Max, we had a grassland protocol that was developed and then kind of exercised and run through the process and completed into a transaction that was highlighted in Ducks Unlimited, worked on that, and the Climate Trust and Chevy, and ended up being the eventual offtake. And as at the press event, as Debbie Stabenow walked out of the room, Senator Stabenow from Michigan, the last thing she said to us as the staff at USDA was, "I'd like to see more of these transactions." So with that, you know, we have an interest in trying to figure out how to get more of these transactions going. So that's a little bit of history. Conservation finance is top of mind for me right now. What's on your desk? What are you working on right now?
So that's exactly what I'm working on right now. We've been exploring cropland management more broadly several years ago, and from that we identified avoided grassland conversion as sort of the high value target from the perspective of creating tradable offset credits. And we're able to get a grant from the Packard Foundation to develop our protocol there. So that was adopted last July. It takes a lot of the work that came out of that American Carbon Registry protocol, which included a lot of work that came out of our forest avoided conversion protocol. It's a tight community. We all learn from each other. And having Ducks Unlimited already go through that process with that protocol and then sit in on the work group and say, okay, here's what didn't work for me. This part was really hard. Try to do something different here. We put a lot of effort there. We knew these were not going to be massive volume projects. So we put a lot of effort into streamlining. We've got a streamlined quantification. We've got streamlined additionality. So you can do large projects quickly, and they can run for 100 years without much effort. So what we're really excited about is that once that protocol was in the finishing stages, there was a new round of conservation innovation grants coming out of the USDA. And we partnered with Environmental Defense Fund and CAECO-ISOM to propose a 2-year CIG to continue working on the grassland protocol and start where the reserve usually stops, which is adopting the protocol, and keep working and keep going into implementation. How do we try to develop the project? How do we verify these projects? All the things that usually the project developers have to go out and learn on their own, which is expensive and sometimes leads to problems, and more importantly leads to time. And we don't have time. We need to reduce emissions now. So this grant has been just wonderful. We're able to partner with these other organizations. We've been able to use it to take the time to sit and develop tools to help project developers. And then CAECO-ISOM is helping us connect with landowners and land trusts and people around the country to educate them as well as get feedback on what we're doing. And EDF is working with the Climate Trust and SCS Global to develop pilot projects. So we're going to take projects through the process, get credits issued, figure out how it works, what do we need to change in the protocol, and at the end of this process, other developers, all the barriers are going to be much lower. They can come in, a lot of the prep work has been done, people have figured out how it's going to work, and we've always got an eye toward the Air Resources Board with this. When we developed the protocol, we tried to make it fit as well as possible into what could be an excellent California compliance protocol, and now we're going to try and prove it for them and say, here it is, there's a bow on it, take it to the market.
Great. Okay, so we might be able to fulfill Senator Stabenow's wishes eventually here, huh?
I hope so.
I've heard good things about that protocol. I haven't read through every page of it in detail, but I've seen some of the lookup tables and things like that, which ties into
It's a gripping read.
Into what Mark, what's on your desk right now? What are you working on?
So just to sort of work from what Max was just talking about, one of the big parts of pulling together these transactions around greenhouse gas reductions is quantification. And I've been working in Keith Poshion's group at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab for the last 17 years on quantification systems. And sort of the culmination of that work, we're on sort of version 5 of a set of web-based tools to support that sort of effort. It's called Comet Farm and Comet Planner tool. These are tools that we've developed to cover the entire spectrum of land use, so from forestry to agroforestry to grazing land, animal agriculture, livestock, and as well as cropland, with an eye towards letting producers, natural resource managers, the registries, NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and state agencies really go in and assess, well, what are the potential greenhouse gas benefits of different sorts of activities with an eye towards decisions that get made at the individual livestock herd or the individual forestry parcel or the individual farm field. So you can go in and identify what the emissions or greenhouse gas reductions associated with conservation could be, or an action associated with an offset protocol at the individual field level to support the decision making that goes forward for some of these transactions. We've got the Comet Farm tool is also works with, we've got another tool called the Comet Planner tool. It's more regionally based to allow people to do a quick assessment. It's a 3-click tool where somebody can come in and do very rapid assessment in just a minute or two around what the potential reductions in greenhouse gases might be associated with a single land use practice or maybe a combination of a couple of land use practices, such as reducing tillage in cropland or changing grazing practices on grazing land. We've got a lot of work going on in California right now, and I'll just close with this. The tool set we've developed so far in both Comet Farm and Comet Planner were developed largely with commodity crops in crops that are grown outside of California largely. The tools cover about 60% of the cropland base and grazing land base in California, but we've got some gaps there around specialty crops. We've been working since November under a contract with the California Department of Food and Ag, and with support from the NRCS and also the Farm Services Agency and the Agricultural Research Service to add some of the most important prevalent specialty crops to these tools. So we've been working, and I'll just run through the list here. We're adding almonds, wine grapes, table grapes, walnuts, pistachios, lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, and kale, strawberries to the system. And so when we're done with this, which we expect to be finishing about this time next year, we'll be able to cover more than 80% of the agricultural land base in the state of California with these tools, so that programs going forward under the proposed Healthy Soils Initiative here in the state, where we can provide quantification to support those programs as they go forward. So it's been a lot of fun. I was just in the Imperial Valley this past week, also the Coachella Valley and some other places, learning a lot about citrus and dates and how lettuce is grown. It's quite a bit different from corn and soybeans in the Great Plains and the Corn Belt. So
Great.
that's what's on my plate.
Well, that sounds interesting, Mark. Thank you. Okay, Claire, so you can't see your desk, but what's on the top of the
Top of the pile.
top layer? What's on the top of the pile right now?
Yeah, so this is going to be a big year, I think, bleeding into next year a bit in terms of strategy development around how we work land use and management into the state's climate policy. And the driver for that is the update to the scoping plan. So this will respond to the governor's call to establish 2030 emission reduction targets, as Edie mentioned this morning in the plenary. And in addition, he called for managing farms, forests, rangelands, and wetlands so that they store carbon. So there is a mandate to manage what we're lumping in and calling natural and working lands to store carbon over time. And so we've been developing the natural and working lands and agricultural sector of the scoping plan. We put out a draft concept paper in March and held a couple workshops on that, and gotten some initial feedback around sort of the thesis that we put forth, which is that we need to manage land for resilient carbon storage, keeping in mind all of the other co-benefits that land provides, and co-managing for those co-benefits. So things like watershed protection, productive agriculture and forestry, sustaining communities, recreation, wildlife habitat. So it's a bit of carbon and everything else that we're looking at, which is always a challenge. But in honing in on the carbon, I think we've seen a real need to do a deep dive on inventory and monitoring, reporting, and verification, and to understand how the statewide target for managing land for resilient carbon storage plays out at the project scale and at the landscape scale, and to see consistency across those quantification methods and accounting. Along with that, and feeding into that, on my desk is the Forest Carbon Plan. So this is a document that was called for a couple years ago, and it's a multi-agency effort, also working with the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And I do want to mention that as California develops all of these policies for state land management, we work very much with our federal partners, including everyone up here, as well as NGO partners and producers as well, because about half of California is owned by the federal government, and we do consider that land part of California's forests, California's rangelands, California's desert land. So understanding how we can work with federal land managers is important. And the Forest Carbon Plan specifically hones in on forests. So how can we manage forests for resilient carbon storage along with all of the other co-benefits they provide. And we include urban forests and urban greening in that definition of forests. And so there's a huge opportunity to sequester carbon in our urban forests. I think the recent comparison of the latest FIA forest inventory analysis data and some studies that have been done of urban forest canopy cover in California and carbon sequestration shows that urban forests store about as much carbon as on a kind of incremental annual basis as rural forests, or kind of the forests that we think of. And so that's a pretty interesting statistic. And of course, that provides co-benefits for shading, mitigating the urban heat island effect, increasing energy efficiency of buildings, and all of that. And I think all of this is being done. So we're trying to think strategically, build the runway for managing land for climate change. But that's being done sort of in this background of crisis management, because we are in a real time of ecological stress in California right now. We have an ongoing drought that has exacerbated a bark beetle infestation in much of this state. It was mentioned in another panel today, there are about 60 million dead trees and counting in California right now, and there are huge stands in the southern Sierras in particular where there's 90% or more tree mortality. So that is a landscape shift that's occurring, and so there is. The governor has established, he declared a state of emergency last year to address this tree mortality epidemic, and there's a task force with, I think, 140 organizations and counties and state departments tasked with addressing this issue. And, we're really looking at how do we manage this crisis. We will need to manage public health and safety, of course, is topmost in that state of emergency declaration. So there's the call to remove these dead trees from power lines, roads, evacuation routes, where they might damage human lives or property. But then looking broader, into the broader kind of watershed scale of, these massive stands of dead forests. How do we start removing the trees so that we can put these stands on a faster path to recovery than would have happened without that kind of activity? So a huge task force has been mobilized to respond to that. And on the investment side, feeding in and always top of mind for all of this is the governor's proposal for next year, or fiscal year 16-17 spending, which includes about $320 million of investments in land protection and management and restoration. And the spending categories for that, and that's the auction revenue or the greenhouse gas reduction fund, really supports the thesis that we're putting forward in the scoping plan for the natural and working lands, which is we need to protect the existing carbon storage, so land conservation. And I think we're looking at land conservation not just to protect land for the carbon that's there, but also to promote infill development and to put that pressure on the urban areas to contain their growth, to reduce vehicle emissions and other infrastructure-related emissions, and then to manage land to restore or enhance the carbon sequestration potential of that land. So it's sort of, protect the principle and then invest in the types of activities that will see that grow as much as possible over time, as well as, decline as slowly as possible over time, or be able to recover more quickly, as is the case with tree mortality. And so I think those are kind of the big bundles we're working with. There's a lot of overlap and moving parts, but it's going to be a fun year.
Great. I'd like to dig a little bit more into that greenhouse gas reduction fund, but let's save that as we get into the big finance discussion. So Michelle, what's on your desk right this minute, or maybe, what's come off your desk recently too?
A lot of things that are on my list are responding to all the reports that Claire and her colleagues put out.
Thank you for your thoughtful responses.
Providing input. At the highest level, our organization, my colleagues and I, we're working on making sure that AB 32 is successfully implemented, and that there is an extension beyond 2020. So, and then cap and trade program can be extended beyond 2020. Within that, so there's a whole legislative angle where, we work with our colleagues and stakeholders to educate, provide, support, and hopefully with this year, next year, we can see some certainty around the extension of the cap and trade program in addition to all the other reduction efforts. We've been working on the implementation of cap and trade. The forest protocols is an area where we've worked extensively with a number of other folks. We continue to work on that and the build out of additional offset protocols, and there's a lot of dialogue around sector-based crediting and tropical forests, which is of interest to us. Another area of work is the greenhouse gas fund and auction proceeds. You hear different terms being used, and so there's a whole budget process going on right now where it's over $2 billion, that have been proposed to be spent, and I think the revised budget should be coming out soon. But there's over $300 million, as Claire mentioned, for natural and working lands. So we're doing a lot of work to support that, if not augment that more for natural working lands. We'd love to see a multi-year appropriation for this sector, similar to other sectors. And we're also working on the scoping plan and trying to do analysis, to help create the enabling conditions for long-term policies and incentives for natural working lands as part of our overall climate strategy. And so we're doing research on looking at greenhouse gas reduction potential for our land base in California. And I do want to just mention that we just finished a report with Sonoma County Agriculture and Open Space District. John Nickerson was part of the team, my colleague Alex Loomer, where we have developed an accounting approach that's a county scale accounting for greenhouse gas reductions, looking at land use changes in land management and conservation. So if you look across the landscape at that scale, how can we forecast greenhouse gas reductions? How would we monitor that over time? And we've coupled that with a sort of multi-benefit assessment, so we can look at opportunities around greenhouse gas reductions, but also know, where we might be able to combine that with water quality benefits, biodiversity, recreation, agriculture, et cetera. And the idea behind that was to link that to incentives. So link it with greenhouse gas reduction funds, link it with other incentives. It could be CEQA or NEPA, or, you could think about how you might pair up incentives with this kind of accounting architecture. And it's a way to engage local governments and landowners in planning efforts and implementation to reduce emissions at that larger scale, looking at the land base.
Great. All right. So this morning we heard from Treasurer John Chang about green bonds and climate bonds, and I wouldn't mind exploring this topic just a little bit more. There's a group called the Climate Bonds Initiative. Maybe some folks have heard about that. They're trying to put together the structure of what is a climate bond, what is it not, and what is it in the ag, forestry, and other land uses. Let's see. Let's start with Claire on this one. Is there any potential for using like the greenhouse gas reduction fund more as a revolving loan fund, or seeding a loan fund, or any kind of financial mechanism where you can actually get some returns? Because we're kind of hearing across the board, this is a pretty dire issue that we're going to have to deal with. $300 million from GGRF is a big start, but I'm not sure that it's really going to be enough to carry us. Are there ways to use GGRF funds to kind of leverage other funds?
Sure, and they are. I mean, many of the programs within resources, at least that I know of, have matching requirements, so typical to a lot of government programs and NRCS programs, and so they are pulling in money from federal and private partners, as well as kind of the project developers or the landowners themselves. So those programs are really designed to grow the overall pot of money available. In the kind of scoping plan thesis for the natural and working lands sector, we stated that we do specifically want to align the targets and the mechanisms with federal, private, and even local and regional investment objectives in the same spaces and activities, again, for that same reason, to grow the pie available to do the work. And the The auction revenue, last year put out a 3-year investment plan for how ARB is required to put out this, and the Department of Finance is required to put out this investment plan for each 3-year period, and they put out the last one at the end of last year, and it does call specifically for kind of new, I forgot what we called it in there, but new ways to invest. And there is no requirement within the auction revenue itself that it has to be spent on grants, and it's spent in lots of different ways now, so it could be spent as more of a loan or revolving loan, if that's how the program was structured. So I think we'll see perhaps all of these programs evolve as they continue to be funded. It is, we have been talking with folks within different departments within state government too, just about the potential to use bonds in the adaptation space. So we're looking at a lot of new infrastructure that's going to be needed to protect against sea level rise, protect a significant amount of public infrastructure, as well as, of course, private property. And so that's something we're starting to look at as well. And it's, we're seeing examples of that happening in Europe and in some places in the States and even California.
Great, thanks. Michelle, what do you think about using, I think of TNC and I think of then the wing that's NatureVest, and I know there's some preliminary work going on with NatureVest. What's your opinion of some of these, kind of bigger bond type uses or revolving loan fund type efforts in the state of California? How would you feel, do you think that's a good use of funds, trying to get that seeded and get a big bond fund together?
This is not an official TNC position, so
okay.
But I think there's interest, and for us, we'd want to make sure that it's a great idea how to leverage private capital for greenhouse gas funds. You just need to meet just all the legal requirements of achieving reductions, and other people from the state could probably speak to that better. But sure, it'd be a great way to do that, and we'd want to make sure that our natural resources, our natural infrastructure is a part of that, as well as other hard infrastructure and investments in other sectors. But it would be a pretty innovative way of trying to leverage more capital.
So Max and Mark, Max, when we start to talk about this, these big volumes of money and investment and the potential for big, I get a little bit nervous. There's a lot of money. You've seen kind of corruption on the news from time to time, and people going to jail and all that. I'm not saying that that's happening in the carbon market, not at all. I think these are very charismatic projects, and they're only valuing carbon. Are there ways to think about the protocols in a broader sense? Or at least raise the price of carbon a little bit. These are what we see as people are calling charismatic carbon projects. Sure. Should they pay for it?
Right. Yeah, the carbon markets have come a long way since the sort of Wild West carbon cowboys days when who knew what sort of things happened. But now it's all very open, transparent. I believe registries have had a lot to do with that. But there is a lot of work to be done on the demand side. And I think that there are voluntary buyers, like we see with this Chevy transaction with Ducks Unlimited. There was a particular buyer and a particular seller that they fulfilled each other's needs, and I'm sure the price that they were paid made the project worthwhile. And that's the kind of market we're in now, is that particular seller has to meet that particular buyer, and they're out there trying to find each other. We don't have a liquid market where there's lots of buyers and sellers. We have more sellers than we have buyers. There are more voluntary credits available. I do think something like grassland and ag in general is seen as a bit more sort of charismatic. But in some cases it can be more expensive to develop. These are not huge volume projects unless you're able to scale them up. And we're not getting enough projects happening other than forestry. Forestry has been very successful for it to scale up yet. So, there could be other ways, we look at demand. It could be on the sort of large company side people like Chevy who are saying, well, we're going to use this and we're going to tell a story. We've got PR to do. Or, as I said to you, the USDA has been great at putting money out in there for us to sort of build the basis for what we're doing here, for doing the research, for doing the protocol development, for doing some on-the-ground testing. Now a lot of that's been done. There's a lot of sort of methodologies available. There's a lot of tools, and people are ready to do it. So maybe now the government can buy the credits, put the money into the other side, and help stimulate that demand. And just as it takes project developers to see other projects happening to feel more comfortable with it, sometimes it takes people buying offsets for other people to get more comfortable with buying offsets.
Good point. Well, I can touch on that a little bit. I can't talk to too much of the details about the purchasing of offsets by the federal government. I know that in some of the executive orders that the president has put together, there was Executive Order 13514, kind of boring there, and then 13696 replaced that, which is requires the federal government to look at our facilities and reduce our carbon footprint. And I know in the previous guidance for 13514 that offsets were explicitly not permitted to be purchased. However, RECs were permitted to be purchased. So there's a revision of that guidance with the new executive order, and there definitely has been some exploration of what type of maturity has the carbon market experienced since that previous guidance had been released. The new guidance has not, to my knowledge, been released yet. I suspect that'll be later this fall maybe, or early winter, that they'll release that new guidance. But I know they did conduct some interviews with CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, conducted interviews and explored the state of carbon offsets in the voluntary marketplace. And they definitely did a lot of listening. Now, as far as what their decision is that's beyond my pay grade. So, but that's about all I can say on that at the moment. Stay tuned, and I will stay tuned as well. Now let's come to Mark, though. But talk about, we're talking big finance here. And Mark, you were a little bit involved in the Ducks Unlimited Chevy project, right?
I was, yeah.
And then also you've been involved in helping develop the new car grasslands methodology, right? And the lookup tables in that, which I've heard glowing reviews of. What do you think about big money coming into this next? What if the stakes are starting to get a little bit higher in the carbon markets,
right?
And so we definitely want to be certain, and we also, where we aren't certain, want to be able to quantify our uncertainty.
Right.
So, what about quantification of uncertainty? And
yeah, that's been an ongoing dialogue in this space as long as I've been involved. The appetite for risk on the part of the people financing these offset projects is really defined by the uncertainty of the models, really, or the measurement systems that are being used to quantify these things. It's a difficult problem because depending on the source of the subsource category that you're working in, if you're looking at, say, for example, avoided grassland conversion, like we worked on with CAR and with the Ducks Unlimited project there, the uncertainty can be relatively small compared to other source categories. It's like on the order of 30%. Now that, you take that to like a mortgage financer and they say, oh my God, 30% finance risk, that's crazy. I'm not even going to touch that. But then when you look in other source categories, the risk is even higher associated with that. But it's interesting, when we first started working on this project, on these avoided grassland conversion projects, we started working with Billy Gascoigne at Ducks Unlimited. He's an economist who, over the course of about 3 weeks, taught himself to be basically an ecological modeler, learned how to use our models, and started trying to quantify the risk associated with the project they were trying to develop for Chevy. And like about every couple of days, Billy would call me and ask me, is there a lookup table we can use for this work? Something that can prevent me from having to run the model 10,000 times here to figure out what the uncertainty is associated with this? And we told him no. And then he ran through the tape on the project, did a good job developing what they estimated the avoided grassland conversion credit would be associated with that project, and went forward. It got financed, tied a bow on it, and I think Billy then went to sleep for about a week to catch up on his rest. And then a few weeks later, we got a call from Max and said, hey, we want to develop a set of lookup tables for avoided grassland conversion in the Great Plains associated with avoided grassland conversion. And so we went to work, spent several months going through and doing assessments, running models across basically all the rangeland we could find in the northern Great Plains, in the prairie pothole region and other places, and built these lookup tables. And what we find across the board is that generalized regional landscape level approach is much more beneficial than trying to run the models individually for a bunch of parcels associated with a single project. It reduces your transaction costs dramatically. You've got a fixed uncertainty associated, or a much better assessment of the uncertainty, and it also has the advantage of if you can spread out the parcels that you're trying to buy or the land you're trying to retire from conversion, you're also spreading out the risk, the land use conversion risk at the same time. So it's a much better approach, I think. So,
I should also mention the matchmaker in that process was our other consultant, Tim Kidman and WSP Group. They were really instrumental in helping us connect with you guys and build that quantification.
yeah.
Great. I'll tell you what, we've got about a half an hour left. I'd like to encourage anybody in the audience, if you have questions to start, don't hesitate to come up to the microphone, and we'll get a few questions going and pepper the panel here a little bit. Before we do that, I've got kind of another question that'll carry us for. So Keith Poston recently wrote in Nature that evidence points to agriculture as the first instance of human-caused increases in greenhouse gases several thousand years ago.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way, because now we're kind of coming full circle here. And later in that paper, Keith and his co-authors wrote that there's the potential for about 1.5 petagrams CO2e per year globally to be achieved from soils at a carbon price of $20 a ton. Michelle, how do we get to that carbon price? I'm not going to hold Keith and his co-authors to this number, but they're saying if we can get up in the $20 a ton ballpark, that you can achieve 1.5 billion tons globally of carbon dioxide equivalent that gives back on an annual basis. So there's kind of a big gap here. We've got a carbon price, which is somewhere between the, high side. What's a good charismatic project, Max?
Voluntary side, I think we would see maybe 4 to 8, maybe more for the right buyer and seller.
4 to 8, maybe maximum of 10. Regulatory, or on the offset market trading, let's just call it 10. Yeah. So we've got to double our carbon price, but then it sounds like there's a little bit of more appetite. And then there's a social cost of carbon. How do we kind of get there from here? And do you have any ideas about this, Michelle?
Well, I think that's sort of, if we go back to the Kyoto Protocol to now, I mean, it's almost like that's the story of, a top-down approach globally hasn't seemed to pan out very well. There are efforts that are more, I guess it's slightly more bottoms up, where countries are making commitments to greenhouse gas reductions, and you're having regional and bilateral commitments being made either through cap and trade programs or just traditional, loans or grants being made either country to country or from jurisdiction, down through states and landowners. I think it's a mix of all of that, so I don't know if you'll ever get a global price of $20 per ton that can go to everybody, right? But it's more of what is the menu or portfolio of actions that may be taken that could be the functional equivalent of $20 a ton. And so that could be funded through various carbon pricing mechanisms, and that likely needs to be a part of it based on all the discussions that we've been having. But there's land use change. There's I think your colleague earlier talked about how do we talk about this in terms of the benefits, the other benefits achieved and the cost savings achieved, and being able to value that, communicate that, find the early actors and the people who are willing to be the first ones to take the plunge and be the example to get their other colleagues to take the same steps, and show that investments can be made, but also you can achieve a savings that may be, close to the equivalent of $20 a ton or more. And so it's probably a mix of a whole bunch of things. And so long as we kind of create sort of the parameters around it, the goal, and what are the rules that we're all going to play by in some kind of consistent and transparent way, then I think we can think of a whole number of mechanisms or bonds, to help really kind of create that value.
Do you see any desire, or do you see any, and maybe you've explored a little bit on the local kind of, is there a kind of a local carbon initiative similar to food or other things? Does local carbon mean more to people than just buying offsets?
I think there can be, right? If you're talking about the slow food movement, or getting your food more locally. It's a communications thing, but you could certainly start that. And a lot of the Sonoma County and the counties that we've been talking to about local climate action, they're creating their own climate action plans and creating that kind of communication that would support doing more local actions and activities to support their own local greenhouse gas goals.
Are they willing to put money in it?
Yeah, there are. Well, and I'll just use Sonoma County as an example, but I mean, they have their own sales tax initiative, and I know not all counties have that, but they have an open space district, that's funded through local sales tax, and they're going to turn around and reinvest in their landscape and help meet their climate goals.
Both adaptation and mitigation goals?
Yes, I think I'm not sure where this state is of their adaptation planning, but that's something that they've been working on.
Great. And Claire, you had something to say.
Yeah, well, I would add a couple things. One, I thought the relationship to the local food movement was an interesting one, and I think it's just like we all get the calories we need each day eating whatever's in front of us, but the local food movement, it seems to be about people valuing things other than just caloric intake, whether it's supporting local farmers, seeing the agricultural landscape preserved, and I think it's the same thing with land use and management in the carbon market, is that there are those co-benefits there, those other reasons that people are investing in land protection, restoration. I mean, we heard this morning from your colleague, and I think we all know that folks who are engaged in industrial land management or commercial land management, like farmers, ranchers, in the timber industry, they aren't going to do things that run counter to their business, and so they are seeing adoption of some of the NRCS practices, for climate smart ag and other things as advantageous from a business perspective. So they don't maybe need that full $20 because they think they can bring in a portion of that. They see that as their return. And I would just add that the first year, the suite of programs that are in the governor's budget for next year were, most of them, not some but not all of them, are new, but most of them existed and went out in kind of a first tranche of grants last year. So forest protection and management, agricultural land protection, and land use planning around agricultural conservation, wetlands restoration, and others. And all of those programs were oversubscribed, some of them 6X. I mean, I think the urban forestry program got 600% more applications than they had funding for. And this year, in the we're straddling years here in government budgets, but in the 15-16 budget, so none of the, and I think Ashley Conrad-Sada will be talking about the auction revenue in much more detail tomorrow, so I don't want to go into it too much, but last year the legislature didn't approve any funding for the natural resource investments out of the auction revenue. Those were all held back and added to what's being looked at for next year. The only one that went ahead was something called the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, and that's because it technically was a continuous appropriation that went through the Strategic Growth Council as part of their Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. So it's, first of all, it's interesting that the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which is to promote infill development and assist disadvantaged communities, is paired with an agricultural lands conservation program, because that shows that kind of two sides of the coin in land conservation and infill development. But that program has gone forward, and they just closed on applications Monday. And they're still tallying what they got in terms of applications, but when the pre-applications were due a little while back, they were already at something like $17 million above the $40 million that's available for that program. And they were expecting to receive more as full applications. So there's really there's no shortage of willing actors out there to supply this. And as far as price, the Legislative Accounting Office came out with a report. The Air Resources Board does a report on climate investments each year. And the Legislative Accounting Office took, there's a table of programmatic funding dollars that went out and the associated greenhouse gas emission reductions that the Air Resources Board released, and then the LAO took that and looked at the dollars per ton from each program. And I have to caveat to say that I think it's not a full picture of the actual cost because, for example, none of the programs that had matching requirements, the matching funds weren't included. So
Right.
It makes it look like some of the programs are much less expensive than they actually are. But several of the natural resource programs were very inexpensive. They range, I think the forest health programs, which are a series of forest management programs, were something like $4 a ton. Yeah. And then, we're talking about the full revenue pot, but there were other programs, in fuels and transportation that ended up costing hundreds of dollars a ton. And I don't, that money does not need to be spent on a cost effectiveness basis. There are a number of other, spending requirements on that. Certain percentages have to go to disadvantaged communities. We want that money to create jobs and increase health across the state. But it's just interesting to see, if you consider that truly, what it quote unquote cost to do that work, there's a huge range. And I think there's just so much more that individuals and communities gain from all of those investments that just looking at the dollar value is not going to tell the whole story.
Right, yeah, exactly. Well, I can definitely feel your pain on that oversubscription by 6X. That's kind of with our EQIP programs. It's constant, and there's the conservation opportunity, there's the desire there that you can't fulfill. And so it seems like if there's some really good matchmaking that goes on, seems like a conservation finance opportunity right there waiting for us with all of these oversubscribed interests that we just can't feed. But let's go to Robert Parkhurst, who has a question for us.
Sure. This is for Claire and Max. Claire, the SALC is a great program, and I'm so glad the state's doing it. One of the things when they considered that back in December, I want to say, it looks at the conversion of cropland to residential. And one of the things that the board was wrestling with was how could you measure the greenhouse gas emissions from changing grasslands to croplands, and Max over there has a way to do it. What would be your process in thinking through of maybe in a future round of funding, being able to use the tool that the reserve developed to be able to help preserve some of the rangeland in California?
And so that program is open to rangelands as well. In the first year, a number of rangelands conservation easements did get funded. But you bring up a valid point, and actually kind of an interesting point about that program, which is that all of the greenhouse gas quantification ascribed to that, or all of the emission reduction benefits ascribed to that program are associated with avoided vehicle miles traveled, not land-based carbon sequestration. I'll just stop there, which is, which is interesting. And there are several reasons for that. And I know the Department of Conservation and others are looking into how to bring land into that quantification. But I think that just highlights the need to continue to develop all of these, methods, even if it doesn't seem like they're getting immediately adopted at the federal or state or international level, that those kind of advancements are important to inform the process.
Do you have anything to add, Max? Robert
Yeah.
included you in the question.
No, I think, two thoughts. One is that, we would love that for areas that want to participate in that program that are under threat of cropland rather than development, it would be great if that program could allow for the use of the tools that we've developed. While developing those tools, we did assess other conversion scenarios, and we looked at, specialty crops, and we considered whether we could include factors for conversion to development. And development is much more complicated. So you need to know a lot more about what it's coming from and what it's going to. And this approach that Mark talked about, where it's a more sort of composite emission factor, sort of breaks down there because it's so management dependent and so dependent on, are you converting it into lawns in a place that's dry and now they're irrigating? Are you actually going to start sequestering a lot of carbon that wasn't there before? Or is it in a place where actually, no, you're going to dig up and lose a lot of carbon and put down pavement and drive cars? So the spectrum there, the error bars could be really big. So it's something that we didn't tackle the first time around, but would love to.
Great. So we can look for that in the future?
Sure, with funding.
All right.
Good
Next
afternoon.
question.
My name is Evan Edgar. I'm with the California Compost Coalition, and happy International Compost Awareness Week. I have a question for Claire and for Max. First, for Claire, we've been highly supportive of the short-lived climate pollutants and the AB 30 scoping plan to get organics out of the landfill. With that, we take the methane, we make energy, and we make compost. And then with the wood chips, we make biochar. So we are making energy and good compost input to the working lands. So we're highly supportive of that. And for Max, is that we've been trying to get some type of compost use or biochar use protocols developed. And that's a missing link here today. I'm the only guy talking about compost, and we can get organics out of the landfill and get the wood chips with biochar back into the working lands. And we've been working on some carbon projects for years, and my question is, let's develop some protocols for compost use and biochar use.
Sure. So there is a protocol for compost use at the American Carbon Registry. So it's not something that we've tackled, but they do have compost addition on certain grazed lands in certain areas, and that seems promising. The way that our grassland protocol is designed, you could actually combine those two. You could do those projects on the same land. With biochar, we looked at it years ago, and it might be something that we should look at again. So there is a white paper available on our website that kind of gives some of our thoughts on biochar, specifically for use as an offset and why we didn't move forward with it at the time.
And for Claire, because of the support of the Healthy Soils Initiative, we hope to use some of that money in order to create those protocols and make a regulatory protocol at CARB for that. So we're looking forward to working with you at the Healthy Soils Initiative.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Compost, Claire. Do you think what's the state of compost in the scoping plan? Let's just start.
Yeah,
there.
so the short-lived climate pollutant plan, I can't remember actually if it's in the final strategy that just came out, but I know the first version, and as we were looking at it, it made sense to talk about kind of how to take organic waste to its highest and best use from many production sources to many use sources. And so municipal compost, biochar coming from agricultural production into orchards that get taken out, as well as forest management activities. Biochar has actually gotten kind of a new focus within this tree mortality context, because there's only so much you can do with 60 million dead trees after they've been dead for 6 months or a year. And so they have low or to little to no value for really anything but burning in one form or another, whether that's for energy production to turn into biochar or any other purpose. And with the state's landfill diversion requirements, as well as the black carbon reduction requirements, we can't, we're not going to be sending those trees to landfills, and we don't want to burn them in place, which is kind of the traditional practice for when you have too much wood and there's nothing to do with it because of high transportation costs, because of the black carbon impacts. And even if we leave that wood in place. I mean, this is really what to do with downed wood is really top of mind within this tree mortality task force, because there have already been wildfires and we're coming up on the wildfire season, and it's looking to be worse than last year, if that could be possible. And so having a lot of dead wood sitting around is not going to be good in terms of wildfire risk. So biochar certainly come up as one of these things to do with it. And the Department of Food and Agriculture, is looking at, is biochar an appropriate fertilizer? I think we heard the term carbon cowboys and the Wild West days of carbon markets. I think we're in the Wild West days of biochar still. And so there is now a number of groups looking at how to kind of standardize applications. Biochar is not appropriate. It's really biochar because whatever you use to produce it could have an impact on its effectiveness. So I think that's an area where further study would be very helpful.
Right. Yeah. Well, great. Thanks for the. Looks like we have another question. Yes, sir.
Following that, although I have this image of Clint Eastwood in the Wild West and biochar, I just can't shake from my head after that description. I'm Tim Duane. I'm an attorney, also a professor at UC Santa Cruz in environmental studies, and I also teach climate law here at the University of San Diego Law School. The 60 million dead trees, we're talking about this issue of black carbon, also the wildfire risk, a lot of co-benefits, including human health, associated with not having those go up in flame. I'm wondering what connection there might be, if any, between the AB 32 greenhouse gas reduction fund expenditures and thinking about co-benefits, and meanwhile the CPUC procurement process for electricity under the RPS, which might include biomass. We've also just recently had a lot of biomass facilities contracts expire, they're shutting down, exactly at the time when we might want to be thinking about actually linking those two. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure. That's another thing that's on my desk, bioenergy.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that emergency proclamation actually included, and this is way in the weeds for folks who don't pay that much attention to emergency proclamations in California, but did include a couple of orders that directed the California Public Utilities Commission to issue certain procurement requirements for bioenergy because of the issue that was just raised, which are a number of the especially larger, older, existing facilities are going out of business because they were on 20-year power purchase agreements that made sense at the time, and now other renewables have been so wildly successful in California that the price per megawatt is so much less for solar and wind that utilities, no one's buying the bioenergy anymore, but it's an important disposal pathway for this biomass. So I think that is, and we start in if you look at the forest carbon plan and some of this other work, you see there's really managing land to store carbon is very different from reducing emissions in other sectors, because what you're basically doing is a mass balance equation. It's what would have been. You always think of if a tree falls in a forest and it doesn't make us and no one's around, it doesn't make a sound or not, and we're having that same thoughts in forest. If we weren't to do this activity in a forest, what would have happened? Does it increase wildfire risks? Do we count that as part of black carbon emissions under the short-lived climate pollutants program? What if you do prescribed fire? How do we count that kind of beneficial use of fire and production of black carbon against the reduced wildfire risks? So we really, there's really no other way to go about it than solving for these systems as a whole. And it's exciting that we're open to that in California, and I think that's one of the areas that you'll see us go deep on this year.
Yeah, bioenergy is really interesting. I've been involved with the biogenic greenhouse gas accounting framework at EPA that EPA has been working on for 5 years now, and 2 scientific advisory boards later, there's still no kind of decisive solution coming out of EPA. So I'm not sure that that's the only thing holding back the biofuel sector. There's pretty low natural gas prices right now, but it sure would help if they could provide us with some clarity on the accounting there. Let's see, it looks like we've got about, I'm getting the card, we've got about 5 minutes. Are there any other questions from the audience? I've got a few questions, but they're GMO related. So go ahead, Robert.
I can ask another one. So what geography and what land types are most exciting to you guys over the next 12 to 18 months? So if you're going to be working on projects, what excites you the most in those areas?
Mark, why don't you start off? Sure. Because you've got a lot of things on your plate, right? And you're kind of in the analytics of this. So.
Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of work with folks at UC Davis, particularly Will Horwath's lab, and also Louise Jackson and Sonia Brodt and Martin Berger and some others. And looking at what's going on in agriculture right now, it seems like there's this really interesting convergence with what's going on with the drought. There's been a huge investment in shifting from flood irrigation to drip irrigation right now, and starting to spoon feed plants with the through drip irrigation. And as it turns out, that process dramatically reduces nitrous oxide emissions. In my world, we talk about nitrous oxide in agriculture being the 600-pound gorilla in the room. It's probably one of them. It's one of the biggest source categories. It also, there seems to be the greatest potential right now. So what excites me right now going forward, here in California especially, is the potential to expand that practice. They've had great success in tomatoes. Expand that practice in cropland into other crops where there are good opportunities, and we could potentially see a big reduction in greenhouse gases in ag. Nitrous oxide is the biggest sector in agriculture. It's about 5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, just nitrous oxide from soils. So it's an important source category. I'm excited to see the potential there.
Nice. Max, let's see, at the Climate Action Reserve, you all have a little bit of work on nitrous oxide. Maybe you can talk about that, but also talk about the sectors that you see for the next 12, 18 months that really excite you.
Yeah, so the other, I've mostly spoken about one conservation innovation grant that we were working on grassland, but we're a part of several, and they're all very exciting. So the other big one is nitrogen management, primed by EDF, and looking to, we already have a protocol for fertilizer reduction and reducing the nitrous oxide emissions that come from that, but haven't had uptake. We would like to talk to people, talk to stakeholders, get out there, find out how it could be better, update that protocol, really push it out, get more people using it. Because again, it's one that, like, if you could scale it up, as you said, nitrous oxide is a huge opportunity. It's a very high GWP. And then to Robert's question of geography specifically, when we were looking at in our grassland SIG about where should we go, we pull up the cropland data layer, and you light up the country with it's yellow cropland, and then sort of the green grassland here and there. And there's parts of the country where there's lots of green, there's lots of grassland, but there's, the middle of the country, right? They're growing corn, and it's all yellow. And if you start zooming in on those big blobs of cropland, and you start to find the green pixels, and that's some rancher there with his cows, with corn growing all around him, and that's the geography I'm excited about, because that's what we want to find, is that grassland, and protect it and keep it there. Keep that yellow cropland from continually taking over all those lands, the real pressure and threatened areas.
But still keep them working, right? So
yeah.
They can be grazed, and they
keep the animals out there. Don't move all the animals into CAFOs. Let them be on the grass.
Great. Michelle, what about you? I won't make you carry the nitrous oxide thread any further.
Well,
think Robert's question was just, well, I'll just say the bigger vision, or what I think would be terrific to see over the next 12 to 18 months really is both in California and at a national level, just the continuing to build a role for natural working lands in the big climate picture. So part of that is getting the analysis done, being able to talk about our natural working lands from a climate perspective, what it means in terms of greenhouse gas reduction potential, so that it becomes part of, just like we talk about transportation and energy, it becomes part of the dialogue and builds more support from a policy perspective, in addition to offsets, which is just sort of one sort of mechanism for natural working lands. It can probably unleash a whole bunch of more creative thinking about the policies and incentives we can produce for natural working lands. So I think getting that information out there and communicating it in the right way will go a long way in really creating an enabling environment for more policies and incentives on the ground.
Great. Yeah, I agree with you on that one. And I think, well, the IPCC even published that, right? They said we're going to need deep reductions in emissions, but we're also going to have to rely on the land use sector to help us stabilize at 450 or 2 degrees. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's really going to be critical. So with that, I think, how about if I give Clara the last word on what kind of what do you see for the next 12 to 18 months, and a little bit more about your scoping plan. I mean, where do you see kind of the rubber hitting the road on that?
Yeah, I'm with Michelle. I'm excited about it all. I can't pick favorites. And, I think Glenn Murray from Ontario mentioned it in an earlier panel, just to begin to understand that the carbon base represents more stored carbon than annual emissions from any other sector and all other sectors combined in a lot of places. They're working with the boreal forest. We have a lot of forests in California and rangelands that contribute to that balance here. But I think he mentioned, and I was kind of excited to hear him mention it, because I think we feel the same way in California, that we don't really have a solid sense and a real consensus around what that value is and what the trajectory is if we don't do anything about it. And I think nature is starting to tell us what that trajectory is looking like, looking at tree mortality and other things. And the history of California and the United States and the whole world is one of land conversion and development. And so kind of your back of the envelope knowledge suggests that we're going to be in decline unless we do something about it. So I think being able to build scientific consensus around what that trend line is and the interventions we can make in it, and understanding kind of the scope and scale of each one of those interventions is going to be most interesting.
Great. That's our $1 trillion opportunity, I guess, right? Well, with that, I'd like to thank you all. We're out of time. I appreciate you all joining the panel and the thoughtful discussion. I also appreciate the kind comments from the audience, and I think we're on to cocktail hour now. So look forward to follow-up discussions with you all. So thanks.